Unexplained objects in the sky have been a part of history ever since human beings began recording their experiences.
They're part of our popular culture. They say something about us.
Lights, angels, and monsters descending from above appear in virtually every society's folklore.
The UFO reports are not going away, they're actually increasing.
These fantastic objects have become inextricably linked with extraterrestrial life forms. And many theories have been created to explain their origin and purpose. By studying our own UFO stories, we may gain a better understanding of their true significance.
Just because Canada covers so much physical territory, I think we are in a unique situation. This may be our century for us of putting cases into the field which actually teach us something about the phenomena. And I think we have advanced our understanding of the phenomena a little based on these cases which hold up to close scrutiny.
Whether they're psychological or sociological or physical, they're real enough to matter.
The largest World's Fair ever, Expo 67. The international Twin Island Wonderland is ready for its gala opening ceremonies. It's expected that some 35 million people will come to the exposition. Host Canada is among 62 nations who have built 100 pavilions on the 1,000-acre site. The fair marks the 100th anniversary of Canada.
1967 was a pivotal year in Canadian history. As host to the World's Expo, Canada had secured its reputation as a modern and enlightened country.
Canada was in a can-do, positive attitude. People were looking toward the future, and the attitude was that Canada could go anywhere and do anything.
And now, here's a special out-of-this-world free offer. This moon rocket kit. First, blast off. It separates in midair and lands 2 spacemen on a moon map.
But by 1967, in Canada, the UFO question became as relevant as our need to explore.
And for people all over the world, the heavens have become a part of man's world. And as you talk to us from
1967 was important in that there were so many major UFO cases that were reported in that year that it ranks as one of the classics of all time.
In that year, there were no less than 200 UFO sightings reported in Canada, 2 of which remain the most thoroughly documented UFO cases in history.
UFOs were real, they were relevant, and they were here and they were now. They had come down and touched the earth and touched our minds and our imaginations. They were now part of the Canadian fabric and part of Canadian history.
But the UFO age did not begin in Canada. The origin of the modern flying saucer myth was a distinctly American story.
The Kenneth Arnold sighting in Washington was what many ufologists refer to as the birth of the modern UFO era.
On Tuesday, June 24th, 1947, businessman and pilot Kenneth Arnold was flying his Cal Air aircraft over the mountains of Washington state. Arnold was a member of the Idaho Search and Rescue Flyers. He had heard about a missing C-46 Air Force transporter lost somewhere near Mount Rainier and decided to spend an hour checking out the steep cliffs and deep crags of the mountainside. The weather was clear, not a single cloud in the bright blue sky. Arnold was gazing down on a high plateau when a flash of light caught his attention. For a moment he tensed. It could mean he was on a collision course with another aircraft. But the only other aircraft in sight was a distant DC-4. A second flash caught his eye. Now he knew where to look. From the direction of Mount Baker in the north, a formation of bright objects flying at an incredible speed was heading toward Mount Rainier. To his surprise, there were no projecting parts like wings or tails on the objects. At first he thought they were a squadron of jet aircraft, but he had doubts. Arnold pushed up the window to see the objects better. They were flat, not quite circular. Using a watch, he calculated their speed to be 2,000 miles per hour. The squadron passed by Mount Adams and finally disappeared over the horizon. The show was over. It had lasted only 3 minutes. The press got wind of it the same day, and reporters were convinced they had something that would make headlines. The matter was sensational, and the witness, reliable. They were flat as a plate, and so smooth that they reflected the sun like a mirror. The things flew like saucers when you make them skip on water. The press took its cue, and the catchy name Flying Saucers made its way around the world. The flying saucer legend and the UFO era were born.
Is it a bird? Is it a plane? Is it a dream? The American Broadcasting Company presents The Search for the Flying Saucers with Walter.
The media coverage of the strange bat-winged objects that Arnold had witnessed fueled a paranoia that had been slowly growing in the minds of Americans.
We are not equipped to have in our whole reality system, to have our whole belief system turned upside down or questioned in an instant.
But I did see it, and I did clock it, and I just happened to be in a beautiful position to do it, and it's just as much a mystery to me as it is to everyone else who's been calling me the last 24 hours wondering what it was.
Kenneth Arnold was a seminal event because it was the first time that somebody had actually seen something and come back and talked about it.
And whether it has anything to do with our Army or our intelligence, or whether it has to do with some foreign country, I don't know.
They were a little worried about it because it had just come out of the Second World War. And then the bomb and duck and cover and all of those things were all around in 1947.
Deshalb innerlich nicht zu uns gehört.
Only 2 years had passed since the horrors of the Second World War. And with the descent of the Iron Curtain over Europe, North Americans were now facing a new fear: communism. The Red Menace caused fear that countries such as China, Russia, and Cuba were secretly developing new weapons and aircraft.
If you like being scared by assuming that there are cosmic powerful forces beyond imagining manipulating our lives to their own horrible ends and nothing can be done and we're all doomed, and you know, hey, there's no more powerful heroine in all the world than despair.
Since Kenneth Arnold's sighting of unidentified flying objects, North Americans wondered if communist countries had advanced technologies that gave them the edge.
I think there was probably a degree of concern in the public psyche at that time.
These were the McCarthy years, when witch hunts and anti-communist hysteria were at their peak.
If there were any such evidence against me under any law, the proper authorities could move against me.
Through 47, through 48, sightings persisted from Witnesses that can only be considered professional witnesses, pilots, policemen, military people, some close encounters with aircraft, this kind of thing.
As a seasoned pilot, Arnold's description of the flying saucers he saw seemed to defy the technology of the day, causing the media to speculate beyond the borders of national security.
Half the people in the country are scared to death. Undoubtedly, there is something to the story of the flying saucers.
North Americans were forced to further challenge their belief systems when 2 weeks later, farmer Mac Brazel made a shocking discovery near Roswell, New Mexico.
Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army. Army officers say the missile found
At that time,
last week.
Roswell, New Mexico was home to the world's only stockpile of nuclear weapons. The military quickly cordoned off the crash site, confiscating all the evidence.
And the thing that kind of made it grab headlines was the fact that the Army seemed to be announcing the fact that indeed a flying disc had crashed on a local rancher's farm in New Mexico, and that they were attempting to recover the pieces.
And suddenly we have this case, this alleged crash, that something was really there and seen by someone and touched, and there were pieces there, and there were government investigations, military cover-ups. Again, we had elements that seemed to combine to create an audience in some ways receptive to the possibility of aliens really being out there.
Roswell and Arnold began the UFO era, but it would mature in the 1950s when Canada and the United States would be forced to wage a private war against UFOs.
The flying saucer mystery makes headlines, and puzzled officials wonder, what was it?
The UFO phenomenon took a dramatic turn in the 1950s. Both the United States and Canada began experiencing UFO incursions over military facilities. Canada took the lead in adopting a shoot first and ask questions later policy.
As early as 1950, there were UFO incidents in Canada that were going beyond mere sightings, causing a great deal of concern amongst the military brass.
Never before had a country come so close to shooting down an unidentified flying object. On the night of July 1st, 1950, Canadian Forces personnel were on duty in the control tower of the Dartmouth Air Force Station in Nova Scotia. At 11:15 p.m., their radar detected an object, although there were no aircraft expected at that time. Whatever was out there moved out to sea, then raced back toward land at an incredible speed. Petty Officer Carter and Able Seaman Connolly had never witnessed anything like it on their radar before. They began thinking the radar was malfunctioning when they received a radio call from another serviceman who was watching the object hover nearby. 9 minutes later, the radar followed the object as it zoomed back out to sea. Carter and Connolly stared in wonder as the craft remained over the Atlantic for 10 more minutes before disappearing into thin air. Investigators determined that the men were inexperienced and their radar equipment not sophisticated enough to register anything other than conventional aircraft. But the top brass were concerned, and they put the station on high alert. Within weeks, the control tower's radar again detected a UFO, this time traveling at over 900 miles per hour. The Air Force was prepared. A Sea Fury fighter with orders to shoot to kill scrambled in pursuit. Receiving instructions from the control tower, the Sea Fury pilot was able to make visual contact with the unidentified flying object. And then, the unexpected. The UFO charged at the Sea Fury, and as the pilot prepared to open fire, it simply disappeared from sight. In the control tower, radar contact was also lost, leaving everyone pondering what had just occurred. Never before had a country come so close to shooting down an unidentified flying object.
I think it was obvious to the men involved, to the pilots, to the radar operators, and even the brass, even though there is some denial in their investigation to admit to it, a reluctance that in actual fact, of course, these objects were not anything conventional. The flight characteristics, the speeds, the maneuvers at that time were just way beyond the capability of 1950s aircraft, or certainly anything we produce today.
2 years later, America had its first radar contact with UFOs.
In Washington, ghost-like objects dart across the radar screen at the CAA Traffic Control Center at National Airport for several hours, traveling more than 100 miles an hour. Air Force jet fighters spend several hours chasing the objects plotted on the radar scope.
The Washington incident took place in 1952, when strange lights appeared over the Capitol, witnessed by hundreds of people. Just like in Canada, armed fighters were scrambled to intercept the UFOs. The individual attempts of both countries failed to capture any UFOs, or even to admit their existence to the public. Then, along came Sputnik. Russia was about to take a lead in the space race, and the threat of nuclear holocaust eclipsed any thoughts of UFOs in the minds of the Western world. North America would unite and form a protective barrier over our common skies.
And in the air age, geography has new meanings for the safety of the American and Canadian people. What was once the impassable Arctic now provides the quickest routes for attack from a wide sector of Europe and Asia. The nation's leaders decided on a tremendous undertaking. This was to build, with the cooperation of Canada, a radar early warning line north of the Arctic Circle.
The Dew Line, as well as the Mid-Canada and Pine Tree lines, demonstrates the incredible lengths to which we went in order to reduce the threat from unknown enemies.
Once those types of systems were in place, anything that came into view for the radar was considered fair game, a target. Its importance to keep track of individual objects entering and leaving space became very, very paramount.
The NORAD radar system is probably the most sophisticated piece of technology that man has put together, other than the equipment for getting into space. The way it can track things that move through the skies around North America is quite astounding. Not just in low Earth orbit, but up there, up in space as well.
Enemy aircraft are over Canada and headed this way. Normal broadcasting has been discontinued until after this emergency has passed.
NORAD is very much, of course, interested in UFOs just by the nature of their work. If you have a blip or an unknown in your airspace or above it or in space, they have to identify this. They have to account for it. So UFOs, despite the fact that they may not publish reports or want it to be too widely known that they have a vested interest in it, it is very much their business. They would be remiss if they did not attempt to study UFOs.
NORAD has got to be seeing these unidentified flying objects coming in and out of North American airspace. They've got to be. They can't not see them, you know? So what's the scoop?
So your job is to go down to Earth as quickly as possible. Find out how far they've progressed in the rocket industry. And you know the rest.
Earth bound by flying saucers. Invasion near. The Earth launch interplanetary counterattack.
By 1955, Hollywood had taken notice. Alien invaders were about to become part of our popular culture.
Back in the 50s, Hollywood B-movies were not good for the poor guys that were trying to do the research there. You know, people would go to the B-movies and laugh and snicker, and when they came across somebody who was trying to do flying saucer research back in those days, they got laughed and snickered at too.
Not that they all agree in their description of the thing as a saucer. One woman said it looked like a 5-room house. Many people see that when the housing shortage will be over, but explanations vary as much as descriptions.
People want to see types of images like flying saucers and creatures and BEMs, bug-eyed monsters. But at the same time, ufology tends to say, well, wait a minute, that's not really what we want. We want people's testimonies to be uncluttered and uncontaminated by what they might see on television or on film.
Science fiction trained me from an early age, you know, unbelievable stuff, sure, okay, you know, wild, exciting, impossible things, fine, okay. But they gotta make sense. There's gotta be a logic behind it somewhere, you know? Illogical people don't build starships. Or at least not good ones, you know?
In spite of Hollywood's fantastic depictions of flying saucers and aliens, there were others who sought a logical answer to the origin of the discs.
This is W.B. Smith, Ottawa, Canada. I would like to say a few words on the philosophy of the saucers. What manner of creatures build and fly them? What do they look like? How do they think? Are their ideas and ideals similar to ours? Could we understand them?
Wilbert Smith was probably one of the most progressive, open-minded, inquisitive North American scientists ever. A remarkable man who used his brain and his power of thinking to look beyond what it was that he did.
Smith was a senior radio engineer for the Department of Transport. He was a pioneer in Canadian broadcasting.
And headed this way, normal broadcasting.
In addition to his regular work, Smith was also fascinated with auroras and cosmic radiation. But it was geomagnetics that intrigued him most. He wondered if this invisible resource could be harnessed.
At the same time, he had a lot of relationships and liaisons with U.S. officials. He also had an undying interest in the UFO phenomena.
A magazine article piqued Smith's interest in flying saucers. Then, while attending a routine engineering conference in Washington, D.C., he met with the American government scientist, Dr. Robert Sarbacher, who revealed a shocking secret.
There's communication now that's well documented in a matter of history between Sarbacher and Smith, and in that, Sarbacher confirms that indeed that UFOs exist, and that in the U.S. they're actually the most top secret thing, as he puts it, 2 points higher than the H-bomb. Sarbacher told him that in fact they know that there had been bodies recovered even, and there was confirmation that these things were extraterrestrial spacecraft that were penetrating our skies and defense systems, and the U.S. government was taking it most seriously, and perhaps Canada should too, was the suggestion.
If these beings are able to come across time or able to cross dimensions, then What's the makeup of these beings that are able to do that? And Wilbert Smith was interested in that and used every method at his disposal to try and figure it out.
Under our concepts of physics, no creature of flesh, blood, and bone could withstand the terrific forces which would be associated with such actions. Therefore, we are likely to assume that the Saucerians must be either some manner of robot or a creature the like of which we have never encountered.
In 1953, Wilbert Smith sent a report on flying saucers to his superiors stating, "We are faced with the substantial probability of the real existence of extraterrestrial vehicles, and that such vehicles use a technology considerably advanced to what we have." 3 months after writing this letter, 10 miles west of Ottawa, the world's first UFO detection station was opened.
It acknowledged the fact that government was concerned. It acknowledged the fact that government was willing to spend dollars on trying to get behind it.
Department of Communications knew about it, but anybody else in the government wouldn't know what was going on there until it hit the press.
We have equipment for detecting any radio noise that might emanate from these objects, any gravitational disturbances which might result, any radioactivity which might be connected with it, and any magnetic disturbances.
For 8 months, Smith and his men stood vigil, watching the gauges move in their normal rhythmic patterns, hopeful their efforts would yield scientific evidence of alien visitation. On the 8th of August, 1954, at 3:01 p.m., the alarm system indicated that something unusual was overhead.
And even though there was no visual sighting, the readings were so wild and erratic that Smith made an official announcement to the press that indeed a flying saucer had been detected and confirmed over the capital region.
Smith sent a press release that was picked up internationally. Canada had drawn the world's attention to UFOs.
Wilbert Smith's biggest mistake was going to the press with his story. If he'd stayed quiet about it, nobody would have said anything to him.
The government ordered Smith to halt all UFO research, then issued their own press release stating that the UFO detection station never even existed.
The government, the Department of Transport, and the brass and politicians quickly tried to distance themselves from that.
Although Smith never really had the government on his side, he continued his UFO studies on his own, and eventually resorted to using mediums and psychics to communicate with the people from elsewhere.
Further studies on our own, with occasional reference to these people from elsewhere, certainly indicates that, first, these people are what they say they are. Second, that their technology is what they say it is, that it is superior to ours, that ours is inadequate in many respects.
I know he firmly believed that what was happening was really happening. Perhaps he was taken advantage of by some people. Perhaps he was getting a little too headstrong for convenience for some people. And it's certainly possible towards the end he was himself losing it. You really wonder where truth has to be separated from fiction.
He made incredible strides in what he was trying to do, and unfortunately, he went before his work was finished.
Smith died of cancer in 1962. It is possible that in his final days, he was influenced by an emerging subculture known as the Contactees.
Men must prepare soon, to meet with intelligences of other solar systems. You know, there are many that feel that this has already happened.
Contactees believed that they had been visited by godlike beings from Mars, Venus, and other star systems. These fervent believers would gather in the desert in hopes of being transported to a better world by their space brothers.
I want to tell you folks about an experience I had over in Nevada in 1952. A spaceship landed close to where I was at on Mormon Mesa on the night of July 27th, and it came back 10 times after that, altogether making 11 times, and they took me aboard and talked to me, discussed many things about their planet as compared to Earth planet.
For whatever reason, they were attracted to the UFO phenomena, and they put their own bent on it, and that bent was certainly that UFOs were frequent visitors here, and in fact, many of the contactees claimed to be extraterrestrials themselves.
Love one another, stop wars, don't pollute the environment, respect one another. And these are the types of things that we needed to hear, especially having just gone through wars, getting through an era of distrust, going through situations in lives where people really needed some good news for a change.
The word contactee nowadays in the field is largely used as a pejorative. You know, it's not complimentary to be called a contactee. You know, you're either an abductee or you're an experiencer, but you ain't a contactee.
Mr. Nagelschmidt, can you tell me what color tie I'm wearing?
Sorry, sir. I didn't notice.
You mean to say you can remember everything about this man from the spaceship, his hair, the color of his eyes, the clothing he was wearing, and yet, after all this time, you can't tell me the color of my tie?
But you didn't come out of a flying saucer.
Although the contactee movement grew to be quite large in America, it never really took off in Canada, partly because people like Wilbert Smith were instilling a more intelligent approach to UFOs. After Smith's death, the Canadian Department of National Defence continued his work by filing sightings reports and investigating ones they deemed a military threat. Our biggest threat, however, may have come from south of the border.
There's been a number of incidents over the years in the 50s and the 60s where the coordination between the U.S. government and ourselves has not been great. And sometimes it's even come to the point where there's been an intrusion in our airspace and something land on Canadian soil, and by the time Canadian authorities get on scene, they find the Americans already there dealing with the situation.
In 1959, a blip appeared on the screen of a northern Canadian Air Base radar, showing an unidentified object coming over the Arctic. Radar controllers attempted to determine what the object was when it was suddenly lost in what they believed was a crash. They relayed the information to the Department of Transport Accident Investigation Unit in Winnipeg, who scrambled to put a crew together and hurried to the site along the Manitoba-Saskatchewan border. When the Canadian investigators arrived on the scene, the U.S. military was already there. They had the entire site cordoned off and armed guards along the perimeter. When the Canadians asked why they were not allowed on site, the Americans simply raised their weapons and told them to leave. The lead investigator placed a call to his superiors in Ottawa, and after government officials held a meeting to discuss the incident, they told him to leave the Americans alone. Even if Canada wanted to investigate UFO crashes on their own sovereign territory, they still had to beat the Americans to it.
I think it's quite shocking to see that even though the 50s and certainly by the 60s we were walking our own walk in terms of how we were dealing with them, there was still American intervention at will on cases that interested them. And it was, you know, upon sight a bit of an embarrassment and a turf war.
By the 1960s, the two countries agreed to cooperate, and together they developed a research project that aimed for the stars.
But at an unidentified airport not connected with Avro, we get an impression of the type of plane Canada is reported developing. That's right, it's a flying saucer. Now you'll recognize a flying saucer if you ever see a flying saucer flying.
By the 1960s, Canada was in a flap over UFOs. It had become difficult to dismiss the mounting evidence. Cases such as Dartmouth and the Northern Crash, along with the thousands of eyewitness sightings across the country, would be but a prelude to the fantastic events about to occur.
Perhaps, if it could be seen that we could build a similar object that worked in a similar fashion, that perhaps it might cool down the public's concerns about the UFO phenomena. And one of the expressions of that may have been the Avro project, where under contract to the U.S. Army, we attempted to build a flying saucer.
British and American aeronautical designers meet at the plant of Avro Company, Malton, Ontario, where they see the famous Avro jet CF-100 streak through its paces. The designers are meeting for top research conferences at Avro, where revolutionary new aviation developments are reported underway. The jet engine powering...
The Avro car was a disc-shaped vertical takeoff machine inspired by the flying saucer legend. The U.S. Air Force quickly jumped on board, providing millions of dollars in funding. At the time, it was the most classified aviation project in North America.
Designed and built by Avro Aircraft at Malton, Ontario, this unconventional circular vehicle known as the Avro car rises vertically and travels over the ground on a cushion of air. 2 of these 18-foot diameter research vehicles have been built.
The prototypes were secretly shipped to the NASA Ames wind tunnel in California. The design seemed promising, and the first pre-flight test took place in November 1959.
The vehicle was now operating successfully over flat concrete surfaces at a height of 3 feet and at speeds up to 30 knots. However, the aim was to operate the Avro car across unprepared terrain over which conventional vehicles could not travel. The next part of the program was therefore planned to include flights over rough ground with some soft patches. For these flights, the wheels were replaced by landing pads.
Initial test flights of the Avro car were successful, but those in charge had a more ambitious design plan. They hoped to build a craft capable of reaching speeds and altitudes more in keeping with the flying saucers people were seeing.
But as technology advances, we always find time to laugh, perhaps too hard, at pictures of machines, those products of our minds and times, making us look ridiculous, befuddling us, frustrating us.
Projections, artist concepts, and some of the engineering extensions of the project down the road, Project Silverbug, etc., showed that they had some pretty high hopes to how far they could take this thing. But it was quite obvious and interesting to see that we were trying to build an aircraft of any kind that looked like a UFO and attempted to fly and behave like a UFO, but it just didn't have the stuff to do it.
Maybe where the Avro car had failed, others succeeded.
A number of cases could be explainable by a continuation of Avro research, secret research projects of circular crafts and that type of thing. The trouble is we don't have any evidence that anything really flew. I mean, things had hopped off the ground a little bit, but nothing with the capability of the saucers that people were seeing.
The saucer that this man saw may very well be that evidence. On May 19, 1967, amateur geologist Stephen Michalak left from Winnipeg to scour the isolated beauty of Falcon Lake, Manitoba for quartz veins and silver. After only a few hours, Michalak found a decent-sized vein of quartz and set to work. He broke for lunch and was returning to his task when he heard geese calling overhead as though they were in danger. Looking up, he was shocked to see two glowing objects. One of the objects landed on a nearby rock. The other flew off, disappearing into the distance. Michalak was excited and afraid. He stood, rooted to the spot, watching the strange craft as it pulsated with light. When he recovered from his initial shock, he made a detailed drawing in his notebook. 30 minutes later, a door opened. Michalak moved closer and was able to poke his head inside. He called out, but received no reply. He thought he heard men's voices. Outside, the craft seemed to be made of polished glass. When he touched the surface, his glove melted from intense heat. Suddenly, an exhaust vent appeared. A blast of hot gas burst out, and Michalak stumbled back. He tore off his burning clothes and threw them to the ground, looking up just in time to see the craft take off and disappear into the sky. Michalak was extremely sick and was badly burned. He packed up his belongings and marked the spot where the craft had landed. Hiking out of the woods, he caught a bus back into town. Michalak spent a long time recovering from nausea, loss of appetite, and the strange grid-like burns on his chest caused by the unusual craft's exhaust blast.
One of the most fascinating cases because it has all the elements that we look for in really good cases. And the physiological effects as well, the burns on his body, the radioactivity found at the site. RCMP were involved, the United States Air Force, the Canadian Armed Forces were involved, and they were all coordinating and working together, and we have many of those files.
You were injured to some degree? It's very hard to say. I was shook up for the first moment.
The voices you heard, what did they sound like to you?
They didn't mean, well, that's what makes me think that they are United States.
He had no interest in flying saucers. He had no interest. He didn't care about UFOs, and still didn't believe to the day he died that he had encountered what we call UFO.
It's obvious the authorities were there. They investigated. They throw up their hands and say, we don't know what it was, but we do know that something landed in this field and burnt this man. And at least you have the acknowledgement of a phenomena.
Falcon Lake remains one of the most genuine and best documented UFO cases. It prompted Canada to adopt a space object contingency plan. In the months to follow, another case would appear in the headlines. Canada and America would cooperate in the recovery of a UFO beneath the waters of Shag Harbor, Nova Scotia. Another event in the year that would forever alter the Canadian UFO experience.
All of the IL-28 bombers now in Cuba will be withdrawn in 30 days.
1967 was important in that there were so many major UFO cases that were reported in that year that it ranks as one of the classics of all time.
Sightings were occurring in urban areas. They were intruding into our airspace. They were being seen in the daytime. UFOs were certainly real, and they were certainly relevant, and they were certainly becoming part of the Canadian fabric.
You are entering Futurama.
It was a really quite an interesting phenomenon as a social phenomenon and was going on literally around the world. The idea of aliens and UFOs is very much a part of us, a part of our culture, a part of who we are.
It'd just be great to put us together with another species and between us get one same viewpoint, you know? You match your perspective with another culture, the places where they don't match up are always very interesting, you know?
Scientists weren't trained to look into this. Scientists aren't paid to look into this.
I don't think it's important whether the answer comes from whispers from the stars or from the UFO data or from Martian meteorites that may have fallen in Antarctica. The important thing is, can we answer the question definitively to our harshest critics that we are not alone?
We've been sitting talking to ourselves for the last 2,000 years. We're getting bored, you know? We've heard everything we got to say. It'd just be so interesting to meet somebody with a genuinely different perspective on the universe. And how does it look to you, you know?
Everything I saw was out of this world.